What is going on, Diablo fans? Dobrunsky here, and I have a question for you guys. Are you looking for a game to satisfy that ARPG itch after playing the open and closed beta of Diablo 4? Maybe you're looking for a game to play during the ups and downs of the D2R seasons, or possibly you're looking for a fun-to-play game that has a lot of in-depth customization, but isn't quite as insane as Path of Exile and doesn't require essentially an insane build guide to even reach end content. If you answered yes to any of these questions, you clicked on the right video, because today I want to talk about a fantastic ARPG game that I don't think gets the credit that it really deserves, and that is of course Last Epoch. This is a fantastic ARPG that I've been playing after the open and closed beta of Diablo 4, and I just love this game. And I do want to point out that in no way, shape, or form am I sponsored to make this video. I really just picked up this game. I have about 200 plus hours into it. It is a ton of fun, and I wanted to make a video dedicated about it because I really feel like for a lot of those that were maybe turned off from Diablo 4 and didn't quite feel like it was Diablo 2 enough, because I did get a lot of that feedback, this is the game that I highly recommend you guys check out. I want to talk about a number of things in this video. The first is I just want to do a brief overview of the game itself. So I want to talk about the different characters, the skill trees, the specializations, the crafting system, and itemization. And then I'm going to focus on the endgame content and wrap everything up by talking about the pros and cons, or the things that I like and don't like about this game, because I genuinely think it's worth buying, but I do want to make sure that you guys get sort of a full overview of the game before I just suggest you guys buy it. So with that being said, hopefully you guys enjoy the video. Let's jump in. So I want to first talk about the character classes and the character customization in Last Epoch. There is 5 main base characters that you can choose from, and this includes the Sentinel, the Rogue, Mage, Primalist, and the Acolyte. Now 5 base characters might not seem like a lot, but each individual character can then specialize into one of 3 different masteries, sort of similar to Ascendancies in Path of Exile. You can specialize in a particular tree to give yourself more customization and options. For example, the Primalist, you can actually specialize as a Druid, which allows you the ability to shapeshift, so you can transform into a bear and do melee damage, or as a Primalist, you could choose to specialize as a Shaman and focus on elemental damage. So 2 completely different unique playstyles based on the mastery that you choose. So each individual character will have access to 4 different unique passive skill trees, with the first passive skill tree being the base character class, and the 3 additional passive skill trees being tied to each individual mastery. Now, like I mentioned earlier, you can specialize in one of 3 unique masteries, which will grant you full access to that entire skill tree. But the interesting aspect here is that each character will still have access to those additional mastery skill trees. You just can't invest in every single point. So again, referencing the Primalist example, if you specialize as a Shaman Druid, you will have access to every single skill in that tree. But if you go to the Druid skill tree, you'll only have access up to a 50% point in that tree. So this does allow for some very interesting combinations in how you want to shape your character build. Now, on top of each individual passive skill tree, every character class has access to about 20 or so skills, give or take. Now, this might not seem like a lot. You might say, Dobrunsky, that's not a lot of character choice, but each individual skill has its own skill tree. Now, that's where things get very interesting. So let's take the Mage, for example. You look at the skill Meteor, you could, for example, spec it to be a single target, high critical source damage skill. Or you could spec it to have less damage, but fall in a shower of meteors that covers more range and does more damage to a larger number of monsters. So do you want to spec it for AoE, or do you maybe want to spec it for single target boss damage? It's really up to you. And with each individual skill having its own skill tree, there is a ton of different combinations you can use for defensive skills, offensive skills, and passive defensive skills. So just the combination of what you can do between the different passive skill trees and each individual skill is almost limitless, which again, sort of touching on that point I mentioned earlier about having that in-depth customization, it is definitely present in Last Epoch. Now, in terms of itemization, I would argue that Last Epoch is much more in line with the vein of itemization in Diablo 2. So for those hardcore Diablo 2 fans that don't like the concept of a particular legendary affix, for example, in Diablo 4, shaping a whole build, you might find the Last Epoch system a little bit more appealing. So there's essentially 7 different classes of items, and I'm not going to run through a complete breakdown of what every single item can roll, but you basically have your base white item, a magic item, which is an improved white item, rare item, which can roll up to 4 different affixes, and then you have an exalted item that can roll those same 4 affixes, but can roll higher tiers of each individual affix and has more crafting potential. Again, I'm going to touch on crafting shortly. And you have set items, which are just regurgitated versions of Diablo 2 or Diablo 3 set pieces. And then you have unique items that just have a set static range of rolls. They're always the same static item. And then finally, you have legendary items, which are ultra rare unique items that are combined with exalted items to pull a couple randomized affixes off of the exalted item onto to the unique item. And this is completed via a dungeon quest system in the endgame content. Now, the overall kind of theme, or just the idea that I'm trying to get across with itemization last Epoch, is that almost the entire spectrum of these items is usable. So again, that's where I think it's very similar to Diablo 2, because you can use every single item from magic, rare, set, unique, and rune words in Diablo 2. It's very similar in last Epoch. In a lot of different cases, those individual items are useful even into the endgame content. It's not centered around like what I suspect Diablo 4 is going to be, where every character is using all legendary items with maybe a unique item. That's not the case in last Epoch. So that's why I really think a lot of hardcore Diablo 2 fanatics are going to prefer last Epoch's itemization to Diablo 4. Now, in terms of the crafting system in last Epoch, it is relatively straightforward to get a grasp on, but in terms of like the potential for in-depth crafting, that's where things get very interesting. And I think that kind of summarizes last Epoch as a whole. You can kind of dive in and pick a character build and sort of play whatever you want and have fun with whatever you choose to play. But if you want to get through like the highest tiers of endgame content, you need to start to get a grasp on some of the mechanics, and that's just basically the crafting system in general. You have essentially 3 different components to crafting. The first being shards, which are used to either add a prefix or suffix onto an item. You have glyphs, which are used to modify the outcome of using that particular shard. So whether you want to maybe upgrade and replace an affix or just upgrade an affix, you can do that using glyphs. And then you have the rune system, which is essentially used to re-roll affixes or salvage items for crafting material. So again, seems relatively straightforward, but once you get to the endgame content and you find like an exalted item and you have maybe a tier 4 cold damage and you want to use a glyph of chaos to flip it to a tier 5 fire damage for your character, there's like that rolling the dice hoping you get that particular outcome. That's where crafting gets very interesting in last Epoch, and it's sort of difficult to explain in a brief overview video, but again, I think once you dive into the game, you guys are really going to enjoy the crafting system. Now, in terms of the endgame content, it is essentially broken down into 3 different categories, but I do promise you 3 categories doesn't seem like a lot, but there's quite a bit there. And the first type of endgame content is just running maps in the Monolith. So you have a whole bunch of spider webs of these maps that you kind of uncover as you complete more and more maps. You will unlock different maps that you can move towards, and each individual map will have its unique objective and unique loot reward. Now, there is a ton of different encounters along the Monolith map that you can use to re-roll the rewards, or you can use to sort of expand the Monolith so you can see further, so you can kind of like plan your route of where you want to go. There's a lot of different variation, and then at the end of each individual Monolith map, there is a big boss encounter, which it's a pretty epic fight, and if you can take down that boss, you get to choose between a particular blessing, which essentially provides a passive buff to your character. And then you can continue to farm these monoliths over and over again to try and find a certain particular item reward or to farm a certain blessing to make your build work. So there's a lot of replayability in terms of just running these monolith maps over and over and over again. And you can also encounter a random boss, which you can use to reset the entire map as well. So again, between hunting for specific rewards, gathering different items or loot, or looking for a particular path, and then the boss battles to re-roll everything, there's a lot of different possibilities that you can use while you're just running one of the particular types of endgame content. The second type of endgame content is dungeons. Now, these can be accessed via dropping different dungeon keys while you're completing Monolith content. Now, there's only currently 3 different dungeons, which I would eventually like to see more, but the actual concept is very cool. So for example, you have the Temporal Sanctum dungeon, which is a special map that you can use to warp back and forth between different time zones. And then when you actually finish this dungeon, it gives you the ability to craft a legendary item, which is a combination of unique item and exalted item, which I covered earlier. The second type of map is called the Lightless Arbor dungeon, which you're traversing a map that has no light and you're carrying a ember of light with you, which you can use to modify and interact with the environment. So if you want to get through a particular barricade, you can use that ember to burn down the barricade to make your way through the map. And then eventually you take on a very big endgame boss, which you have to use that ember to destroy him, because he's basically immune to damage, but you need to use the ember to kill him. So again, a very interesting, unique mechanic. And the final dungeon is called the Soulfire Bastion dungeon. Now, this dungeon, you essentially can flip back and forth between a fire and a necrotic shield to absorb different enemy type damage. So it's very interesting, especially the endgame boss in this dungeon. He'll alternate back and forth between using necrotic and fire damage, and you need to flip back and forth between using a necrotic shield and a fire shield. So again, very interesting and rewarding dungeon content. I would eventually like to see some additional dungeon types added, though. It would be cool if you could maybe play up to like 6 or 7 or 8 different types of dungeons instead of 3, but the current base choice that they have is pretty good in my opinion. And then finally, you have the arena type content, which is just taking on endless monsters and endless boss waves for loot. So just think of it kind of similar to what the Diablo 4 Helltide event is going to be. Again, just endless waves of monsters for essentially endless loot rewards. So now that I've covered a broad overview of the game and you guys sort of have an idea of what you're going to expect jumping into Last Epoch, I want to cover some of the pros and cons. Now, starting off with the pros, I think the boss battles in Last Epoch are amazing. I think out of any ARPG, they have the most interesting and exciting and dynamic boss fights. There is some very cool boss fights in Path of Exile, but half the time you can hardly even understand what's going on with all the visual animations. Some of the Diablo 4 bosses in the beta, again, it was only a beta, we haven't seen all of the bosses yet, but they weren't necessarily like super dynamic and amazing as well. I would argue that Last Epoch's boss battles are better than any current ARPG on the market. I stand by that. They are very fun. There's not too much going on. You can understand the mechanics. You can get one shot. They're just a very enjoyable experience. In terms of the user interface, it's extremely clean. So whatever you want to open, whether it's your inventory, your crafting, your skill tree, your passive skill tree, it's all just one single toggle. It's there all on the page. It's not quite as, I guess I would say it's easier to navigate than the Diablo 4 UI, which I know a lot of people criticized. In terms of quality of life, Last Epoch has it in spades. There's a loot filter, which you can completely customize yourself. It's very simple to use. There's different map toggles. There's a game guide that you can look up any particular in-game mechanics. So you don't have to like alt tab and go to a website to figure out what necrotic damage is or whatever. You just hit a single hotkey and it's going to bring up your game guide and you can look up any single mechanic instantly within the game to get a grasp on it. So again, that's very user friendly in my opinion. Now in terms of cons, I do wish that there was a couple more mission types to run in the Monolith map. So there is a ton of different area content. So as you're running through Monolith, you'll be running through like a fire dungeon in one area and then like a weird sky mountain area the next one. There's just tons of variety in terms of the area, but when you boil down to the actual mission types, it really just kind of funnels down to like 6 different missions. So I would like to see this at some point at least doubled. Now again, this game is still currently in beta, so I think there is the potential to add more, but that's definitely a con for me. I would also add that the dungeons, I'd like to see more than just the 3. I think they're a ton of fun currently, but if we had at least double the amount of dungeons, just providing more content, I think that would be good. And multiplayer, for the most part, was largely bug-free, but I did encounter a couple issues with loading screens when I was playing with my friend, just almost 10 seconds to load between each different individual area. Again, a lot of these like criticism that I have, the game is still in beta, so there's a chance to improve it. It's close to being fully released. Like I think we're kind of told maybe Q4 this year is when the actual game will fully release, but for the most part, a lot of my criticisms I think can largely be attributed to the fact that it's still in beta and in development. I think a lot of it will be addressed in the future. Anyways guys, that basically wraps up everything that I wanted to cover for this video. Sort of a brief overview, a little bit over 10 minutes trying to cover everything that I liked about the game and what I don't like about the game, and again, just a broad overview. So hopefully you guys found this video useful. Maybe let me know in the comment section below if watching this video you actually want to try Last Epoch, or you've already tried it, you don't like it. Just any feedback is welcome. Other than that guys, hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you guys in my next video or live stream. Peace.
To the right.